Well, good morning once again. I just want to start this morning and ask maybe a question, or maybe it's just more of a statement. Maybe there have been times in your life, in the dead of night, when the world seems to shrink around you, shrink to the size of your own personal suffering. Have you ever found yourself in those moments whispering, or maybe even screaming into the night, "Why me?" Anybody been there? Well, now imagine, if you would, a city that is bustling with life, laughter echoing through the streets, and this city now in a pile of rubble, sitting in the silent aftermath of its own catastrophe. The city is Jerusalem. And maybe there have been times in your life where you have actually felt like your life was in ruins, just like those walls in Jerusalem. If you have, I just want to let you know, you're not alone. We have all faced moments that really kind of test our spirit, they test our faith. But remember this is what I want you to hear today. It's in the ruins that we often find the seeds of our rebirth. So just as we begin this morning, I just want you to kind of ponder that thought and ask yourself, what ruins am I standing in today? What ruins in my life am I standing in? And how is it that I'm finding hope in all of the rubble when all around me it looks like everything has crumbled and crashed? Well, this morning we begin a new series titled Grieving with God that I hope will help you discover hope and encounter peace. Over the next 4 weeks leading into Easter, we're going to be walking through the Book of Lamentations. And one thing about this book is it's 5 chapters long, and it's just a collection of 5 separate poems. Each one is a standalone piece, but they are all woven together to tell a story of both communal and personal grief. And today we're going to look at the first of those. We'll be in Lamentations Chapter 1, if you want to go ahead and turn there. Today I've titled the message, Hope in the Rubble. Now, in Jewish tradition, the very first word of a biblical book often serves as the title of that book. Thus, the Hebrew title of Lamentations comes from the first word in this letter, or in this book, and that Hebrew word is ikah. Now, ikah, we translate that word as how. Sometimes you'll see it translated as alas. Now, this word how serves not just as the title, but it really is an outcry of the heart. It carries with it this profound question, this weight of unspeakable sorrow and disbelief. It really encapsulates the shock, the grief, and the despair that the people in this city were feeling. They've seen this incredible devastation to this once vibrant city, and now it lay in ruins. If you're there in Lamentations chapter 1, we're going to read those first 3 verses, and we'll go back into the rest of it shortly. As we begin, you will see the writer dives immediately into the heart of sorrow and loss. And I want you to see how the lament opens the door to profound dialogue with God, one that allows us to voice our deepest fears and find strength in our vulnerability. So as we walk through this book over these next several weeks, let's allow ourselves to fully experience the depth of our own suffering, recognizing that within our collective mourning, we find a shared journey toward hope and healing. Now, with this understanding, let's look at those first several verses. They'll put it on the screen for you. It starts this way: "How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow is she who was great among the nations. The princess among the provinces has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night. Her tears are on her cheeks among all her lovers. She has none to comfort her, and her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into captivity under affliction and hard servitude. She dwells among the nations. She finds no rest. All her persecutors overtake her in dire straits. Now, the first thing I want you to see here in this chapter is this. We've got to learn to embrace grief. In fact, that's, if you're taking notes, number one, that's the thing you want to write down. Simply this: embrace grief. From these first few verses, we learn this profound lesson of acknowledging our grief before God. See, this book, Lamentations, teaches us that it's not only okay to lament, it's actually necessary for our healing. See, your tears, they actually have power. And lamenting isn't just about expressing our sorrow, though. It's a step that actually helps us move toward healing. In our darkest moments, when we feel most alone, we are invited to pour our heart out to God. Here's what you need to know. He hears every word. He listens to every word. He notices every sigh, and he sees every tear. So circle back to that first word, how, or ikah. This word that it opens with is a profound, soul-searching question that resonates deeply with Jewish tradition. Each year, the Jewish people would read this book during this observance of Tisha B'Av. It's the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. It's when they recall many disasters that happened to them, including the destruction of the temple. And they would they would read this book. But this ikah, this how, invites them and it invites us to go deeper, echoing an earlier moment in time. See, when they read this book, they read it with the understanding of what was written in Genesis. They read this with this earlier question in mind. And this question that they read this in mind can be found in Genesis. It's when God comes to Adam and Eve in the garden and he asks them a question. And he says, "Where are you?" Now, this question was not about their physical location. What it was a deeper inquiry into their moral state. In the same vein, ikah, this how, goes beyond asking the question, how is it the city of Jerusalem came to lie in ruins? The second thing I want us to see in this passage, you may want to take note of this, and this simply this, real talk. This is where we get honest with ourselves. This is where we get honest with God. It's about acknowledging our part in our situation, in our sin, and in our need for introspection. It's a powerful invitation to examine our hearts and our lives in the light of God's truth and His grace. It's time for us to ask, how did I get here? And more importantly, where am I going? This isn't, though, it's not about wallowing in our guilt. It's not about putting shame upon ourselves. It's about opening a pathway to healing and to deeper communion with the Lord. Let's be real about where we are and invite God into those places. It's these words, these where and these hows. They are invitations to ask God questions, to be real with Him. And it's in that real talk, both talking to and listening from God, that we can shift our focus from blame, which we often do when we are in a situation that is less than desirable. It can shift our focus from blame to understanding our role in healing and restoration. When we are real talk with God, it provides an opportunity for us to look inward and also to our community, those who are around us, but more importantly, up to God. It's an open invitation to a heart-to-heart with God Almighty. See, Lamentations isn't just simply a story of ruin. It's our story too. It's about shared loss, mourning, and overcoming loneliness. It's a reminder that in our collective grief, we find a path toward healing. You need to understand that each of us individually are part of a larger story, and we play a role in others' recovery and in their hope. Jerusalem, this city that was the heartbeat of a nation, the joy of the entire earth, now sits in silence. Its gates, once bustling with comings and goings, the things of life, in this particular instance, stands desolate. The streets where laughter and conversation flowed freely echo now with the haunting sound of silence. This poetic lament paints a picture of the soul's desolation when everything familiar, when everything we know, when everything comforting has been stripped away. See, in our lives, we would be lying to say that we haven't known such pain. Now, it wasn't the fall of a city in our life, but instead, we face pain nonetheless. The loss of a loved one, the end of a relationship, the shattering of dreams that left us feeling deserted, mourning what was and what may have been. These verses here today, they beckon us to see our own grief, reminding us that to lament is deeply human. It is to acknowledge the depth of our pain and the reality of our suffering. But there's something profoundly sacred in this acknowledgement. See, in voicing our pain, we are not merely recounting our losses. We are engaging in an act of faith. To lament is to dare to believe that our cries are not lost in the wind, but they are actually heard by God, who is absolutely 100% intimately acquainted with our grief. So as we think about the desolation, the ruin of the streets of Jerusalem, let us consider the spaces in our own lives that feel empty, the losses we've perhaps never fully grieved. Let the cry of this city that we just read about and we will read about this morning, let it awaken in us a courage to voice our own laments, trusting that in our mourning, we are met with the compassionate presence of God Almighty. The next verses in this chapter draw us into this profound sense of isolation and betrayal. We're going to look at just verses 4, 5, and 8. Verse 4 says, "The roads to Zion mourn because no one comes to set the feast, and her gates are desolate. Her priests sigh, her virgins are afflicted, and she is in bitterness. Her adversaries have become the master. Her enemies prosper, for the Lord has afflicted her because of the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone into captivity before the enemy." Verse 8, "Jerusalem has sinned gravely, therefore she has become vile. All who honored her despise her because they have seen her nakedness. Yes, she sighs and turns away." In these passages right here, we witness the compounded grief of a city, not just fallen, but of a city that's actually humiliated, a city that has been forsaken. The festivals it talks about that once brought joy and unity, now they're just mere memories. The community's leaders, once symbols of strength and guidance, are reduced to powerless fugitives. This is not merely physical, but also you need to understand, it also is spiritual and emotional. It's a picture of a community's heart and their soul that's been torn apart. And our lesson here is about turning to God when human relationships disappoint us. Because I'm here to tell you they will. People will hurt you. People will let you down. People will disappoint you. But this is about understanding that even in all of that, we can still turn to God and find in Him a faithfulness that never betrays, that never leaves, that never forsakes. And it prompts us to consider our own moments of isolation, when our actions or our choices have led us away from the path that we knew we were meant to take. As we move forward, the third thing I want you to notice or to consider is this: even in our pain, even in our mess, we can still discover hope. So number 3, if you're taking notes, discover hope. Even when we find ourselves in the middle of devastation, just like Jerusalem, the walls had crumbled, the temple was in ruins. In all of this, the Lord always weaves within His word a flicker of hope on the horizon. This part of Lamentations challenges us to look beyond our immediate pain and see possibility. Possibilities for renewal, possibilities for redemption. And we know those things through Jesus Christ. This hope isn't about us ignoring our pain or pretending it's not there. It's about recognizing that God is present in our suffering, and He holds the power to bring us through it. In the middle of our darkest times, God plants seeds of hope that can grow into new beginnings. So let me encourage you today to open your heart to see the hope that God offers, that it's available here and now, even if all you can see is just a glimmer. In the middle of Jerusalem's lamentations, there's a cry to the Lord, a recognition that even in their darkest moments, even in their moments of sin and separation, God's presence is the path to redemption. The cry is not just an expression of grief, it's a testament to the enduring hope that even when we have strayed, we are not beyond the reach of the divine compassion of God. So are there areas in your life where you have felt isolated, maybe by your own choices? Maybe there are areas in your life where you've experienced betrayal. The question is, what do you do in those moments? Do you turn to God? Do you acknowledge your pain? And in moments where we've actually caused the pain or the separation, do we seek a path to restoration? In the depths of Jerusalem's mourning, we find a critical lesson. Our suffering often leads us to question the presence of God in our pain. Yet Lamentations invites us to see that God is with us, even when we can't hear Him, even in what seems to be silence. The challenge and lesson for us is to seek God, asking, where are you? Where are you at in our lives right now? Where is it that you are showing up? Just as He asks, where are you? Look at verse number 12. It is nothing to you all who pass by. Behold and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which has been brought on me, which the Lord has inflicted in the day of His fierce anger. From above He has sent fire into my bones, and it overpowered them. He has spread a net for my feet and turned me back. He has made me desolate and faint all the day. The yoke of my transgression was bound. They were woven together by His hands and thrust upon my neck. He made my strength fail. The Lord delivered me into the hands of those whom I am not able to withstand. The Lord has trampled underfoot all my mighty men in my midst. He has called an assembly against me to crush my young men. The Lord trampled as in a winepress the virgin daughter of Judah. For these things I weep. My eye overflows with water, because the Comforter who should restore my life is far from me. My children are desolate, because the enemy prevailed. Zion spreads out her hand, but no one comforts her. The Lord has commanded concerning Jacob that those around him become his adversaries. Jerusalem has become an unclean thing among them. Now, this passage is a powerful reminder of the times we felt unseen in our suffering. The imagery of fire down into the bones, a yoke of sin tightly around the neck, it speaks to this inescapable nature of our deepest regrets and the consequences that follow us. Yet within this lamentation, there's a profound theological inquiry. Is any sorrow like my sorrow? Some versions say, is there any suffering like my suffering? Others may say it this way, is there any pain like my pain? Those words echo across the centuries since they were written, and we say them still today, don't we? Is there any suffering like my suffering? Is there any pain like my pain? Is there any sorrow like my sorrow? these words still today reach straight into our hearts. It's a question that invites us not to compare our pain, but to recognize the commonality of suffering. And yet, in this commonality, it also brings this thought or this idea that even though we may experience this common pain, we each experience it individually and differently. This section of the poem challenges us to confront our own mourning, to sit with our suffering, and to allow ourselves to feel it deeply, without rushing to find answers or explanations. It's a call to witness the suffering of others with empathy and presence. In other words, simply being there for them. Sometimes people really don't need you to tell them it's going to be okay. Sometimes they don't need to hear words like, well, they're just better off now. Sometimes people, all they really need is a shoulder to cry on, a hug, arms wrapped around their neck, to know that you love them, you care for them. Sometimes they just need you to sit and shut up and listen to their screaming in the night, to their yelling, why me? Because if we're honest, we've all been there. They don't always need to hear how you made it through or how you're not hurting in this moment. Sometimes all they're really needing is for you to just be. Just be there. Here in this passage, even in the depths of the despair, we see this glimmer of hope, the acknowledgement that our tears are seen, even if by no one else they are seen by God. This hope, though, I'm here to tell you, it does not negate the pain, but instead it affirms our suffering. But it affirms our suffering is not the end of the story. It invites us to look beyond our current circumstances, to seek comfort not in the resolution of our pain, but in the presence of God who actually weeps with us. See, in these verses, we see the rawness of grief and the depth of despair. And in the rest of this chapter, we're going to see the writer continue to articulate sorrow and plea for recognition of suffering. But when you look closely, you will see they begin to also hint at a turn toward seeking mercy and understanding there is a possibility of redemption, that there is hope. Verse 18 says this, "The Lord is righteous, for I rebelled against his commandment. Hear now, all peoples, and behold my sorrow. My virgins and my young men have gone into captivity. I called for my lovers, but they deceived me. My priests and my elders breathed their last in the city while they sought food to restore their life. See, O Lord, that I am in distress. My soul is troubled. My heart is overturned within me. For I have been very rebellious. Outside the sword bereaves. At home it is like death. They have heard that I sigh, but no one comforts me. All my enemies have heard of my trouble. They are glad that you have done it. Bring on the day you have announced, that they may become like me. Let all their wickedness come before you, and do to them as you have done to me. For all my transgressions, for my sighs are many, and my heart is faint." This section of this poem is about recognizing that even when we feel most abandoned, there is a call that we can make. There is a plea for mercy and understanding that will not go unheard. The verses here speak of enemies gloating, of suffering witnesses, people seeing us, in other words, but our pain is not alleviated. This verse reminds us that often our journey takes us through dark valleys. And through those dark valleys, we see that we are observed by those around us. And oftentimes, as we are walking through the darkest, most painful times of our life, those who see us offer no aid. In fact, sometimes when we walk through the pain, it even seems like we are surrounded by people who want to do nothing more than point out our shortcomings, our failure, and our pain. Yet the deeper call in this passage is a call to God who sees. A call to God who knows the depth of our suffering and still holds out the promise of redemption. It's a call to remember that our stories are not defined by our lowest moments, but by the possibility that lies ahead. The opportunity to turn back to God, to seek and to receive mercy. So as we reflect on this first poem, let's ask ourselves, where do we find hope in our own moments of pain? Where do we find hope in despair? How do we turn back to God when all we feel is the weight of our mistakes? How do we open our hearts to the mercy that is always waiting for us, even when we struggle to see it? Goes back to that real talk. Real talk with ourselves and with God. You know, you've heard it said time and time again that our problems aren't too big for God to handle. He can handle you yelling. He can handle you screaming. He can handle whatever it is that you have. But I think as many times as we've heard things like that said, I feel like many times we don't walk in that, though. I don't know if it's shame that we've brought upon ourselves or that others have put upon us. But often the weight that we carry feels like it's keeping us from being real. It's putting this blockade or this obstacle that's in front of us. And I'm just here to tell you today, those are lies of the enemy. Nowhere in the Word do we read about Jesus giving a parable that says, you've screwed up too much, you've gone too far, you don't deserve. The parable that we should look to is the one that shows the Father who sees the Son far off after he went and did things that he didn't need to be doing. And he not only sees him, but he runs to him. A couple of things in that. You've heard it many times, but one of the things is this. He saw him far off, and it tells us that the Lord sees us. He's watching for us. And the second thing is, it says he ran to him. He ran to meet him. Not to condemn him, not to point a finger at him, but to open his arms to him, to welcome him, to put a ring on his finger, signifying the authority of the home, to put sandals on his feet, to say that he was no longer a slave, to put a coat on him, a robe that says, you have been adopted. See, all three of those things meant something very specific. So he sees you in your pain, even in the pain that you may have caused yourself. And he's watching and he's waiting. In the heartache and the pleas of Jerusalem, we find a reminder that no matter how far we may have strayed, the path back is never completely closed off. Our cries for mercy, our acknowledgments of pain, or even our own failings become the first steps back toward hope and healing. Finally, as we draw our reflection today to a close, there's one thing that I want you to see, and that is simply this. You can encounter peace. In the midst of lamentation, in the middle of the sorrow, in the middle of the pleas for mercy, lies a profound peace that comes from surrendering to God's will and embracing His presence in our life. Jesus came to this life as Emmanuel, which literally means God with us. He suffered and died, so He knows your pain. And the Word says He is the Prince of Peace. And the peace doesn't come from our circumstances changing overnight or all our problems suddenly disappearing. Wouldn't that be great? Instead, our peace comes from knowing that in our suffering, in our turning back to God, we find a peace that surpasses all understanding. It's the peace of knowing we're not alone, that our cries are heard, and that God walks with us every step of the way. So if you don't know the Prince of Peace, I want to encourage you to invite that peace into your life, knowing that it can coexist with your grief and with your pain. And so as we navigate the complexities of our lives, may we find the peace and assurance of God's unfailing love and His presence in our life. In our darkest moments, it's hard to see any light, but there's a promise for us all. Our mourning can turn into dancing and our ashes into beauty. There's always a star in the darkest night guiding us home. So this morning, maybe you're facing a why me moment. And if that's you, it's okay. Our doubts, our fears, our complaints are all part of our journey. God can truly handle it. So this week, let's embrace our feelings and look at them as steps toward healing. Guided by the wisdom of Lamentations, know this, you're not walking this path alone. And today, maybe if you're sensing that maybe you've drifted a bit from where you want to be in your relationship with the Lord, know this. His arms are wide open, ready to receive you. No guilt, no shame, just a loving Father waiting to welcome you home. So this week, keep the conversation with God going. Whether you're yelling from the rooftops or you're at a place where you're barely able to whisper a word, know this, He's listening. And if words fail you, just sit quietly with Him. Sometimes the most profound healing comes in the quiet and the stillness. Remember, once again, you are not alone. We are on this journey together, sharing in the sorrow and the joy. And all of this is anchored by the love of God, who never lets us go. Let's pray.